Elizabeth Wharton, born Elizabeth Nugent, entered the world in the early 19th century within a prominent and well-established Philadelphia family. Her father, George Nugent, was a prosperous merchant whose name carried recognition in the city's upper social circles. Elizabeth was one of 6 children born to Nugent's second marriage, alongside 2 older half-siblings from his first, placing her within a large household shaped by status, tradition, and expectation. Growing up in 1830s America, Elizabeth's childhood was governed by rigid social conventions applied to women of her class. From an early age, her life followed a carefully structured path centered on propriety, reputation, and preparation for marriage. Education for young women in families like the Nugents emphasized refinement rather than independence. Elizabeth was trained in social accomplishments considered essential for a lady, including etiquette, conversation, and domestic management, all intended to prepare her for future duties as a wife and hostess. The Nugent household offered material comfort and social security, reinforcing a worldview in which appearance and respectability were paramount. Family standing provided access to elite gatherings, influential acquaintances, and a protected social environment where expectations were clearly defined and closely observed. Within this framework, Elizabeth learned to navigate the demands of polite society, understanding the importance of maintaining composure, discretion, and family honor. This upbringing established the foundation for Elizabeth Wharton's later life. Her family name and social position granted her entry into the upper circles of both Philadelphia and, eventually, Baltimore society. These early years shaped her public identity. Elizabeth Nugent's transition into married life followed the expected course for a woman of her social standing. She married Major Henry Wharton, a respected officer in the United States Army, a match viewed as suitable and advantageous within their social circle. The marriage placed Elizabeth firmly within a stable and reputable household, reinforcing her position in polite society. By all outward appearances, the union was prosperous and harmonious. Major Wharton's military career provided security and distinction, while Elizabeth assumed the role expected of an officer's wife. She managed the household, hosted visitors, and maintained the social obligations that accompanied her husband's rank. Together, they presented an image of order, respectability, and quiet success. Following their marriage, the couple relocated to Baltimore, a city that would later become central to Elizabeth's story. There they established a comfortable home and integrated into the city's upper social circles. Baltimore offered new opportunities for social engagement, and Elizabeth adapted seamlessly, continuing the refined lifestyle she had known in Philadelphia. Over the next 2 years, Elizabeth gave birth to 2 children. Their first child, a daughter named Nellie, was followed by a son, Harry. Motherhood further defined Elizabeth's role within the household and reinforced the appearance of domestic stability. Friends and acquaintances regarded the Wharton family as secure, respectable, and well-positioned. This period of Elizabeth Wharton's life was marked by routine, social engagement, and familial responsibility. Her marriage strengthened her public reputation and established Baltimore as the primary setting of her adult life thereafter. Tragedy entered Elizabeth Wharton's life in 1867 with the sudden death of her husband, Major Henry Wharton. His passing ended what had appeared to be a stable and prosperous marriage and left Elizabeth a widow responsible for maintaining her household and caring for her children. The loss altered the structure of her life, but publicly she continued to present herself with composure and dignity. 3 years later, in 1870, Elizabeth suffered another devastating blow when her only son, Harry Wharton, died. Like his father, Harry had pursued a military career, and his death compounded the grief already present in the Wharton household. Both Major Wharton and his son had been heavily insured, and following their deaths, Elizabeth received substantial insurance payouts. These funds provided her with financial resources that allowed her to continue living in comfort. Despite these personal losses, Elizabeth maintained a large residence on Hamilton Place in Baltimore. She lived there with her daughter Nellie and 2 domestic servants, preserving an outward appearance of stability and respectability. Her home remained orderly, and she continued to participate in social life, hosting and receiving visitors as expected of a woman in her position. Within Baltimore society, however, quiet unease began to surface. While no formal accusations were made, private conversations reflected discomfort over the repeated tragedies that had struck Elizabeth's family. Some acquaintances questioned whether the deaths were simply unfortunate coincidences or something harder to explain. These doubts remained largely unspoken, tempered by Elizabeth's social standing and the absence of evidence. Outwardly, Elizabeth Wharton remained a respected figure, continuing her social obligations while carrying the weight of loss beneath a composed public image alone, quietly. Illness and death continued to touch Elizabeth Wharton's household in the years following the losses of her husband and son. During this period, her daughter Nellie became seriously ill. At first, her condition appeared grave, and there were concerns that she might not recover. Although Nellie ultimately survived, some observers later remarked that Elizabeth's care during the illness seemed strangely ineffective, a perception that lingered quietly among acquaintances. Not long afterward, further tragedy occurred under Elizabeth's roof. Her brother-in-law, Edward Wharton, came to stay at her home, accompanied by his young daughter. Both fell ill while residing there, and both died. Their deaths added to the growing pattern of misfortune associated with Elizabeth's household. As before, the events were met publicly with sympathy and condolences, rather than formal suspicion. Privately, however, doubts deepened. Friends and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the frequency of illness and death with simple chance. Still, Elizabeth's respected position within Baltimore society played a significant role in containing open criticism. Those close to her feared that rumors, if spoken aloud, could irreparably damage her reputation and social standing. As a result, these deaths were largely explained away as tragic coincidences rather than possible crimes. Elizabeth continued to receive support from her social circle, and no official inquiries were pursued. Her status, demeanor, and outward respectability shielded her from scrutiny, even as quiet concern followed her presence. The pattern was noted by some, but it remained unchallenged by observers who remained silent within polite society circles. By the summer of 1871, Elizabeth Wharton was preparing for a long-anticipated journey to Europe. The trip had been carefully planned, and she was scheduled to sail from New York on Wednesday, the 12th of July. Arrangements were made for her to leave Baltimore on the evening of Monday, the 10th, allowing sufficient time to reach the port before departure. Before beginning her travels, Elizabeth planned to entertain guests at her Hamilton Place residence. Among those expected was General William Scott Ketchum, a retired United States Army officer who had served alongside her late husband. Ketchum was a widower with 2 children and had remained a longtime friend of the Wharton family. His visit, however, carried a practical purpose beyond social courtesy. General Ketchum had previously loaned Elizabeth Wharton $2,600, and he arrived in Baltimore, intending to press for repayment before her departure overseas. On the evening of June 23, 1871, he arrived at her home, where several guests were already present. The atmosphere was lively, and nothing initially appeared unusual. During the gathering, General Ketchum consumed beer that Elizabeth stated had been mixed with a herbal tonic commonly used to aid digestion. Shortly afterward, he became violently ill. His condition deteriorated rapidly, leaving him unable to leave the house. What began as an ordinary social visit ended with General Ketchum confined to Elizabeth Wharton's home, setting in motion the events that would soon follow within the quiet walls of a respectable Baltimore household there. On the day following General Ketchum's sudden illness, another visitor arrived at Elizabeth Wharton's home. Eugene Van Ness was a trusted friend and her financial advisor, responsible for managing her accounts and handling complex bookkeeping matters. He worked for the firm Alexander Brown & Sons and maintained detailed records of Elizabeth's finances, including 2 separate ledgers documenting different types of transactions. That evening, Van Ness also became seriously ill while staying in the house. His symptoms mirrored the general pattern of sudden, violent sickness already witnessed with General Ketchum. Physicians were summoned without delay. Dr. P.C. Williams took charge of treating General Ketchum, while Dr. Chu attended to Eugene Van Ness. Despite their efforts, Neither patient showed clear signs of recovery. Over the following days, it became increasingly apparent that General Ketchum's condition was worsening. On June 28, 1871, just 5 days after he first fell ill, General William Scott Ketchum died in Elizabeth Wharton's home. Before his death, it was alleged that he told those present that Elizabeth Wharton had poisoned him. At the time, many dismissed the statement as the confused words of a dying man. Suspicion intensified when Mrs. Van Ness arrived to nurse her husband. She grew uneasy about a milk punch prepared by Elizabeth Wharton and, on one occasion, poured it away, refusing to allow her husband to drink it. With two men violently ill under nearly identical circumstances, authorities could no longer ignore the coincidence. Public concern replaced earlier reassurance within Baltimore society. Following General Ketchum's death, authorities in Washington took formal steps to determine the cause. Police Marshal Bryce, a relative of the deceased, ordered an autopsy once the body was transported from Baltimore. The examination was conducted by Professor William Aiken, who performed both a post-mortem inspection and a chemical analysis of the remains. Professor Aiken's findings proved significant. Chemical testing revealed the presence of tartar-emetic within General Ketchum's body, a toxic substance known for its severe effects. The quantity detected was considerable and inconsistent with accidental exposure. These results established poisoning as the official cause of death and shifted the investigation toward determining how the substance had been administered. Investigators soon traced the origin of the poison. Records showed that Elizabeth Wharton had purchased 60 grains of tartar-emetic from a local chemist on June 21st, just 2 days before General Ketchum arrived at her home. When questioned, she stated that the substance was intended for medicinal use, specifically for preparing mustard plasters to treat her own ailments. The explanation failed to ease growing doubts, particularly given the amount purchased. Further scrutiny uncovered additional concerns. A promissory note documenting Elizabeth's $2,600 debt to General Ketchum disappeared from his belongings and later reappeared without the note inside. Elizabeth claimed the debt had been repaid and the note destroyed. She also asserted that the general held $4,000 in government bonds for her, securities that were never recovered despite extensive searches. With mounting evidence, authorities moved toward formal action. These developments marked a decisive turning point, transforming private suspicion into an official criminal investigation directed squarely at Elizabeth Wharton herself. On the 10th of July, 1871, law enforcement arrived at Elizabeth Wharton's residence on Hamilton Place. Marshal Frey served arrest warrants to Elizabeth, her daughter Nellie, and their 2 domestic servants, informing them they were all suspected in the murder of General William Scott Ketchum. The arrests sent shock through Baltimore society, where Elizabeth had long been regarded as a respectable widow. As the investigation progressed, authorities concluded that only Elizabeth Wharton had the means, opportunity, and motive connected to the poisoning. Her daughter and servants were released without charge, while Elizabeth was held in custody. Efforts by influential friends to secure her release on bail were unsuccessful, and on July 15th, she was formally charged with murder. Investigators turned their attention to Elizabeth's financial affairs. Though born into privilege, evidence showed she lived beyond her means, maintaining an expensive lifestyle marked by fashionable clothing and elaborate entertaining. Eugene Van Ness's bookkeeping revealed mounting debts and questionable transactions recorded in a second set of ledgers. General Ketchum's demand for repayment before her European trip appeared increasingly significant. Past allegations also resurfaced. The widow of Elizabeth's brother-in-law accused her of poisoning both Edward Wharton and his daughter years earlier, claiming a financial dispute as motive. Although these claims had previously been dismissed and the bodies were not exhumed, they now contributed to growing suspicion. Reporters further revived a strange episode from Elizabeth's youth, involving a wedding ceremony for a groom who never arrived. Once dismissed as misunderstanding, the incident was re-examined amid the investigation. These combined revelations reshaped public perception, casting earlier events in a darker light as Elizabeth Wharton awaited trial under intense scrutiny. Elizabeth Wharton's trial was relocated to Annapolis, Maryland, to avoid the intense publicity and local gossip of Baltimore. Proceedings began on December 4, 1871, drawing widespread public attention. The courtroom was consistently filled with spectators, while newspapers across the country reported on every development, dubbing the case a national spectacle. The prosecution, led by Deputy Attorney Frederick Pinckey, presented a circumstantial case focused on scientific evidence and the pattern of events leading to General Ketchum's death. 89 witnesses testified, primarily physicians and chemists, providing detailed accounts of the poison's effects and establishing the timeline of illness and death. Chemical analysis demonstrating tartar emetic in the victim's body formed the cornerstone of the state's argument. The defense, managed by attorneys Nevitt Steele and John H. Thomas, challenged the reliability and interpretation of the scientific evidence. They presented expert testimony suggesting alternative medical explanations for General Ketchum's symptoms, including spinal meningitis, and argued that the chemical tests could have been mishandled or inconclusive. Models of the victim's stomach were used to illustrate these theories visually to the jury. Throughout the trial, the defense emphasized the absence of direct evidence placing poison in Elizabeth Wharton's hands. They questioned the motive, arguing that a woman of her social standing would not risk reputation, freedom, and her daughter's future over a single debt of $2,600. The proceedings lasted 43 days, marked by exhaustive testimony and detailed cross-examinations. On January 24, 1872, after closing arguments and final witness statements, the jury deliberated overnight. The following day, they returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom remained silent as the foreman announced the decision, ending the trial with Elizabeth Wharton legally acquitted. Public opinion was divided, with some viewing justice served and others remaining unconvinced of her innocence. Following her acquittal for the murder of General Ketchum, Elizabeth Wharton faced a second legal challenge. She was charged with the attempted murder of Eugene Van Ness, her financial advisor, who had fallen ill under circumstances similar to the general's poisoning. For this case, she was released on $5,000 bail while awaiting trial. The second trial experienced multiple delays before finally proceeding in January 1873. The proceedings spanned a full month, though they lacked the intense public fascination that had surrounded the first trial. Evidence presented largely mirrored the earlier case, including chemical proof of poisoning and circumstantial connections suggesting Elizabeth's involvement. Despite this, the attempted murder charge carried less dramatic weight and generated comparatively muted public interest. The jury, tasked with determining her guilt or innocence, struggled to reach a unanimous decision. After 3 full days of deliberation, the jurors declared themselves deadlocked, unable to agree on a verdict. The presiding judge subsequently declared a mistrial. In April 1873, the case was postponed indefinitely, effectively leaving Elizabeth Wharton in legal limbo. No further trial was scheduled, and the charges were neither fully resolved nor dismissed. Although legally unresolved, the public and social consequences were severe. Elizabeth's reputation suffered lasting damage. Newspapers labeled her the Baltimore Bourge, and she experienced social exile from the circles in which she had previously been prominent. Former friends and acquaintances, whether due to genuine suspicion or self-preservation, distanced themselves, while charitable organizations that had welcomed her previously closed their doors. Financially, Elizabeth's situation deteriorated further. Legal fees, combined with her prior spending and the depletion of her late husband and son's insurance payouts, left her in a precarious position. She continued to live under a cloud of suspicion, with both society and public opinion imposing a form of judgment beyond the reach of the courts. Her story remained unresolved, the ultimate truth of the events never definitively established.